Okay, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or good evening. We have a large group online from all over the world, so wherever you are, hope you're having a great day. My name is Sally Ozell. I'm the director of the Environmental Security Program here at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. And for those of you who don't know us, we're a research institution, and we focus on national security issues, including those posed by climate change, and the lives and the livelihoods that are affected by climate, particularly in coastal cities and in island states. And so today's event, is part of what we're calling the Climate Talk Series, hosted by our friends at the German Embassy in Washington here, and in partnership with us. The series has really, it's been great. It's had this in-depth discussions covering a whole range of issues, climate security topics, from the existential threat that climate change poses to small island states, how UN peacekeeping can really use clean energy to promote security. The talks have also addressed things like the priorities of the Global South and the intersection between climate change and gender. So again, thank you to the German Embassy for hosting this. It's really been a great experience. And so why is it important? Obviously, we all know this. On any given month, another extreme event is highlighted. A new climate record is broken. Another community devastated by floods, heats, or storms. In today's discussion, we're going to really dive into climate finance. And it's a pretty timely topic. I mean, you know, there have been these relentless storms like Hurricane Otis that just hit Mexico, Acapulco, Mexico, and left it in ruins. And there's been devastating floods killing thousands in Libya. And it just reminds us that the climate emergency is here today. It's not something in the future. Last week, the UN Environmental Program released their Adaptation Gap Report for 2023. And I hate to make people crane, but it's up on the back there, in the back of the room. But it's called Underfinanced, Underprepared, Inadequate Investment in Planning and Climate Adaptation Leaves the World Exposed. Well, I think that pretty well sums it up, of why it's so important for us to have this conversation today. And then thirdly, with COP28 right around the corner in Dubai, you know, this is really an important issue that we know is going to be on the table. It's been on the table at the past COPs. A little bit of progress has been made, but if you read this report, or as I'll highlight in a minute, we have so much more that we need to do. And so with that, I'm really grateful to have our panelists with me here and virtually, and let me introduce our great experts. So to my right is Svetlana Klemenko, and she is the global lead for sustainable finance and lead climate finance specialist for Latin America and the Caribbean region at the World Bank. And next to Svetlana is Elena Perez, and Elena is the Ocean Action Agenda lead at the World Economic Forum, and she's also a member of the Global Future Council for Responsible Resources Use. And online, coming from Belize, is our good friend Carlos Pol. And Carlos is the Director of Climate Finance Unit within the Belize Ministry of Finance, Economic Development, and Investment. And Carlos and his team have partnered with us on one of our Corvi projects, and they are the local champions for the Climate Risk and Vulnerability Assessment, which we are currently doing in Belize City, and we kicked that off just last month. Good morning, Carlos. So allow me to set the stage again a little more. So the big story for much of this year, for those who are knowledgeable about this, have probably heard a little bit about the Bridgetown Initiative, which was unveiled last year in Barbados by Prime Minister Mia Mottley. And the initiative is really an action plan for reform, to reform this global financial system and make it more responsive to the needs of developing countries and island states who, as I said earlier, are really on the front line of the climate crisis. And they're the most in need of adaptation and the least responsible for the climate change that's affecting them. And many world leaders, you know, are starting to express support for this need for this change for the Bridgetown Initiative, including just recently the head of the International Monetary Fund. And so showing that buy-in at this large sort of financial institution is a good sign. It's getting us going in the right direction. And so with this growing attention and developing countries, not too long ago, Prime Minister Motley, she co-hosted the summit for the new Global Financing Pact in Paris with President Macron. Now, the summit didn't quite reach the heights they had hoped it would with major transition, but there were still some concrete successes. And one of the notable wins I'd like to highlight is the new World Bank head, Ajay Banga, he made a commitment to offer a natural disaster clause, start to put those in to allow the World Bank's borrowing countries to pause repayments for their debt when they've been hit by an extreme weather event, freeing up kind of financial resources needed for immediate recovery. Because that's been like this cyclical problem that they have engaged in. They're just starting to get out of debt, a huge storm hits, they have to spend all this money to recover, yet they still have debt that they owe on money they borrowed, and it's just this endless cycle that is a problem. I say the positive, but I must say there are still some troubling signs. Last month, the Green Climate Fund had their second replenishment meeting, and it fell far short of the precedent that was set in 2019. This year, the Green Climate Fund raised $9.3 billion. That's $700 million less than they did in 2019. That's not going in the right direction. Germany, together with Japan, the UK, France, and the United States, have typically led the way in commitments. This year, Germany still led the way in a big way with adding $2.2 billion for this round of funding. So good for Germany for having this lead. Now we need others to do the same. And so this matches this sort of sobering message from the UN Environmental Programme's latest Adaptation Gap, again, the document that's up in the back of the room. The report found that despite very clear increasing needs, as I've just outlined, international public adaptation finance has gone down by 15% between 2020 and 2021. That's not good. And the needs continue to grow. The annual gap is now somewhere, they estimate, between 195 and $365 billion needed for adaptation and resilience in developing countries. So the needs going up, the finances are going down. So there's often we often get hung up on what do these numbers even mean? And so, I just want to touch on one little example, or a big example. We have also a climate adaptation assessment project in Madagascar, a Corby project in Madagascar. And we were there in August, and we really got to see firsthand how these climate-fueled storms are literally flooding homes, washing away homes and businesses on a regular basis, and yet they do not have, the financial means to dig themselves out of this hole. And it's just, again, the cycle I was just talking about. And in Tomasina, which is the city on the coast, which is their main port city, it grinds it to a halt. And that means no goods can get to the rest of the country. Everything just stops countrywide because of this. And so, they really need planning, and they need resilience, and they need adaptation, and they need funds to be able to do that. So, setting that stage with this gap, with these needs, I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and we're going to really hit on innovative financing solutions, nature-based solutions, including debt for nature swap, the importance of sort of holistic assessments of risk to inform a more integrated financing framework, and really try to figure out how best to unlock and mobilize private finance for climate adaptation. So I'm going to start off by asking, a series of questions to try to really get a conversation going, and then we'll turn it over to the audience and folks online to ask questions as well. So Carlos, I'm going to start with you since you're the furthest away, but you look great on our big screen, just so you know. I highlighted the Bridgetown initiative, and so one of the key themes in it is recognizing the debt burden many developing countries face and island states face, and making that burden more manageable So could you tell us a little bit, has debt affected Belize's ability to invest in climate adaptation, invest in itself? And if so, how?
Good morning, Sally. Good morning, fellow panelists, and good morning, everyone. First of all, allow me to thank the organizers, thanks the German for giving me this opportunity to share Belize's experience on climate change, um, on climate finance gaps and needs. Um, I think this conversation is timely, and I really appreciate the opportunity and to highlight for everybody to recognize how Belize is doing, what is been doing, and what needs to be done. I think it's important for me to paint a picture of Belize needs. Belize is in a process, it's a critical process in our climate development and climate change trajectory. What we have done, COVID has came in, impacted it, and has left the economy in a high debt to GDP. But regardless of that, the government ambitious to climate change is serious, and in doing so, we have updated our national determined contribution. We are focused in prioritizing climate ambition and building resilience. I think that's the focus that we as a small development island states, we are working towards. We were also successful in negotiating a debt for nature swap. What will that do to Belize is that it will preserve the marine environment. It has created an endowment that it will be used to finance conservations of the marine project. So that helped the government in reducing its debt and also allowing some breathing space for government to be able to access some financing and much needed climate finance financing. So that's important that it's bit understood. Belize is one of the least contributors to climate change. However, we are considered a carbon net sink, and we are the most impacted countries in this region in the Caribbean, but we are the least one to be able to contribute to that. So we are Belize is very vulnerable, and I appreciate how you started in this in speaking about natural events and those things. Couple days ago, we have been receiving extensive rain for the last 3 days. Now we have experiencing flooding in several parts of the country. So we are vulnerable to flooding. We are vulnerable to drought. We are vulnerable to hurricanes. We are vulnerable to sea level rise, coastal erosions, and other extreme weather events. Of note is that about 49, close to half of our population lives around the coastal area. So you can see the magnitude of the impact that our Belizeans people are experiencing whenever we have those natural events hitting our doors. Belize is also considered, is being ranked 8th by the World Bank out of 160 for climate risk. We are being ranked 3rd for natural disaster, and we are 5th for climate change. So you could see the statistics, the data shows how vulnerable it is. Whenever we have especially a hurricane, let's say category 1, category 2, what economic-wise affects Belize is that it the losses to up to 2020 was about 4%. 2020 onwards, we had the damage is more severe, and it puts us back like about 7% of our GDP. So the average annual loss, it's really significant, and that's a burden to our public debt. So what we are saying is that, okay, we are very ambitious. We want to be a resilient, but we need financing to all sectors, but more particular, and you did mention the private sector. More than 70% of our contribution to our GDP comes from the informal sector, which is the MSMEs, the medium, small, and micro enterprises. So we need to see how we can build that capacity between them. We need to see how we can strengthen their institution, their structures, for them to be able to be resilient in bringing. So what we need affordable, need predictable, and timely climate finance. Why I say affordable is because given our high debt to GDP, we are excluded from some concessional financing or some grant financing. I'll use the example. With the UN, Belize is considered a seeds country, but with the World Bank eligibility, we are not considered as seeds. So we don't have, we are not eligible for IDA's financing, which we believe we deserve given our indicators and given our sustainability and our risks that we have encountered. Predictability is because we cannot speculate our future. Every year we have seen statistics show that every 2 years Belize will suffer a hurricane 1 or 2, category 1 or 2 hurricane in Belize. So what does that mean? Is it automatically will trigger either between 4 to 7% of our GDP. That's the annual average loss. We need it timely. The time is now, and I am, and yes, we were a bit concerned about the replenishment and the reduction on the amount that replenished from GCF. GCF has been one of our critical partners since we have joined the GCF, but we need the financing now. Putting together a bankable project proposal, it takes years for us to be able to see the fruits of actual implementation. So if considerations or instruments or a new approach is being considered, that would really benefit Belize.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I mean, you have really laid out the whole story right there, the story of need in such a compelling way. Thank you, Carlos.
Nailed it.
So if I could, I'm going to turn to Svetlana. I mean, so affordability, predictability, timely finance, those were the three main reasons or the topics for the need for finance after Carlos painted the kind of dire picture they're in. And, mobilizing private finance is really critical to fill the gap that we all have just been talking about, the adaptation gap described in the UN report and as Carlos just described. But most of the adaptation funding has come from public sources. So what are the challenges that you find in your work in mobilizing private finance for climate adaptation and nature-based solutions?
Thank you very much, and I think that both you and Carlos really have already touched on a good number of very important points, and I will probably try to bring a bit more structure to this discussion. So, as you know, I have two jobs in the World Bank. So I'm the global lead for sustainable finance, and as part of this part of my job, we really are trying to understand what exactly does it mean to finance the nature-based solutions to climate challenge. And I'm deliberately using climate challenge instead of mitigation or resilience or adaptation, because actually there is no strict delineation, and especially when it comes to nature, solutions would sort of go across different categories. And to fund something, you first need to understand what exactly you are trying to do, what is your final objective, and what kind of steps, what kind of actions you need to take to get there, right? So in my second job, which is the lead climate finance specialist for Latin America, I work a lot on Amazon. So World Bank now has this memorandum of understanding with IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, and key part of this MOU is to scale up our joint work on Amazon, and actually Germany is a very important part of this dialogue. They have a very special place in Amazon dialogue, and also to work on the Caribbean, focusing on the disaster risk management and other issues. And similarly, we are using this work in the region as the lab, if you want, to define what exactly this means, what kind of value chains we need to focus on to enable these solutions. Because if you are talking about nature-based solutions, you are essentially looking at forests, you are looking at agriculture, you are looking at the livestock, that's a huge, you are looking at the oceans, and then disaster risk management, it's another subset of this, because here you are really looking at a very different kind of situation. The first few scenarios that I mentioned, they are kind of latent, right? So you have time to adjust and to mobilize finance. If you have the disaster case, this is something that is acute. So you need to react very fast. So, and once you have this structure in your head, once you understand what exactly you are trying to do for different parts of this, then it is much, much easier to actually say what kind of finance you need and where. And I will give you a couple of examples building on what you said. So first, indeed, there is a huge debate as to how we could bring the private finance into this agenda. And I have worked with private sector for years. I know how they function. And I can responsibly tell you that, yes, there are certain parts where private finance can and should come in, and there are certain parts, such as conservation, support to standing forests, where private sector would never be able to come in unless we create the totally new market. So that opens discussion on the carbon credits, which is a separate discussion, right? Then to address some of the Carlos questions raised by Carlos. So whether we are talking about debt for nature swaps or funding that can be delivered on more concessional terms. So for those of you not very familiar with the World Bank terminology, when Carlos refers to IDA, it's the more concessional, it's a cheaper funding, right, that the World Bank can deliver. So here, once again, there is no one silver bullet. Debt for nature swaps, they now have a lot of publicity, thanks to Bridgetown, thanks to great advocacy by Prime Minister Motley. But one has to understand that this would work only in certain circumstances. You need to have the right debt profile to activate that. Concessionality also can be delivered in a few different ways. You can deliver concessionality upfront. Sometimes you have the project which requires a lot of cheaper money right now in the first year. Or you can have situation where you implement the reform. It will take a few years for reform to deliver the results. And you want to reward that results later, right? So you need to have a concessionality which is delivered based on the results and linked to some kind of KPIs. So my point here is that as we move this agenda forward, it is very important to structure, understand what is that we are trying to address, design instruments, and then match the activities that we are trying to implement with the available funding in the smart way.
So interesting. So debt for nature is not a catch-all for everything. It has to be structured, focused, understood, designed well, and matched specifically each case. So I'm sure Carlos will have some comments on all of that. But before we go back to Carlos, Ilana, you have done a lot of work on nature-based solutions. I mean, you focus on it. I think we met talking about nature-based solutions for the oceans. And one of the things we've talked about, and I think Svetlana sort of mentioned, it's the need for integration. You can't just look at one issue. You have to look at many issues, and all the issues are different. But also, I think with debt for nature solutions, there are so many co-benefits, including sequestering carbon, which we'll talk more about, stabilizing shoreline erosion, providing habitats, all those sorts of things. Yet funding sources are often single purpose. And so, and they don't often look more holistically at the benefits. So what are your thoughts on how can we bring different funding mechanisms into incorporate these sort of co-benefits in the adaptation planning, in the debt for nature planning? How do we bring those solutions together in a more holistic, integrated way with co-benefits.
Yeah, this is really interesting because what Svetlana had mentioned is very true in the private sector. The way that things are designed right now, people are looking for that return on investment, and oftentimes it's that return on financial investment, right? But if we start to think about what are returns on investment that aren't financial, right? Social returns on investment, biodiversity returns on investment, things that other investors, perhaps not in the private sector, but other investors might be interested, such as philanthropists or development banks. And what are those returns that you can highlight as this is one of the reasons? And then how can we strategically combine those different financial sources together? So one might be interested in that long-term return on investment, but all of those other pieces add up and feed into it and still have a return, but it's not necessarily a financial return. And that's something that we've been thinking about. How do we look at those co-benefits, at those other items that maybe it's not considered that financial return on investment, but it's still really valuable? One of the things that I keep highlighting is also that importance for inclusion. And as Carlos had mentioned, that a lot of times the island nations are excluded from these international negotiations. But when you have more inclusive approaches, whether it's on the ground with communities or whether it's having marginalized nations included in these conversations, you're going to have more successful outcomes. And so even if you're thinking about it from a financial perspective, inclusion actually will have more successful outcomes, better likelihood of returns on investment. So very important to promote that inclusion piece. Just to jump back to some of the work that we're doing, because I also think it ties in a little bit. What they mentioned, all agree with all of these points, but some of the work that we're doing with our Blue Recovery Hubs, it's in collaboration with OECD, World Resources Institute, and the World Economic Forum, and we're working with small island developing states, and it was first, the impetus came from COVID, when a lot of the small island developing states were super heavily impacted, and it was because they were so reliant on a single sector. Oftentimes it was tourism. And so it was really thinking about that huge reliance on one single economic sector made them incredibly vulnerable, right? And so what we saw was cascading impacts, that it not only impacted the economy, but when you had job losses, you had displacement, you had people going back to rural areas where they were, natural depletion of resources, oftentimes illegal fishing, because people needed to survive, they needed food. And so it makes sense, but you see that impact rippled across not just the economy, but across social factors that are really important for health and well-being of communities. And so we have to think about, and what we're trying to do is thinking about how do we build up economic resilience with small island developing states, thinking about what are, in this case, because many island nations have incredible ocean resources, thinking about how do we build up sustainable ocean economies that have been underdeveloped or overlooked so that there is that economic diversification. But it goes back to that idea of those cascading impacts because they're all interconnected. It's not just the economy is separate from social impacts, is separate from health, is separate from biodiversity. They're all interlinked. They impact food security, national security, water security. And so that's why it's so important that we do think about it holistically, and we have to think about those returns on investment that are in addition to finance. And we definitely have to probably rethink the way we approach finance, but that's a big mission.
Well, thank you. I feel like you've just sort of been an ad for our Corby project, the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Index, which looks at social, economic, ecological, and we've just added health. Coming out of COVID, we realized that that was a piece that we hadn't considered. So, because we're doing a Corby in Belize, Carlos, I want to go back to you and I want to go back to you actually about the Debt for Nature swap, if we could. So, you all signed a Debt for Nature swap like 2 years ago. How's it going? What's your experience been so far, and what are you expecting to come out of it? And Debt for Nature, can you explain a little bit more what Debt for Nature swap means for Belize? Like, what kind of nature are you swapping, and what kind of preparation, research, investments going on to get it rolling?
Okay, thank you so much, and I agree with what have been said by my colleagues there. about this debt financial swap being structured, being focused. When this administration came into power in end of 2020, the debt to GDP was 133%. So there's no way that this government had any financing to be able to have projects to at least bring up the poverty rate or reduce the poverty rate that was at that time around 60%. Unemployment 40%. So government have to find a ways, have to find solutions. So what they did, they come up with a plan, a recovery, economic recovery plan. And in that recovery plan, it included selling out of our debt. The debt, the domestic debt and commercial debt we had was too high. So the first thing they do is, okay, let's study, let's see how we can benefit from certain things, but reducing our debt. Because going to the IFIs was not working. I mean, the statistics were not in our favor. So government entered into these discussions with the debt financial swap with the TNC, and then the discussion happened. A unit was created, negotiated. We reached out to our bondholders. We sold our debt for 45% less than what it was originally priced. Creditors, bondholders agreed. Okay, they wanted that financing upfront. So we reached out to, it was a tripartite agreement between government, TNC, DFC, USA, and the SWIFT government. So in doing so, with that negotiation, which was close to a little over $280 million, but the actual transaction was about half a billion. Government automatically save or reduce its public debt to 25% in just that transaction, because of the reduction of selling it to a 45%. So that was a plus for us, and in doing so, we also negotiated other loans that we had with, for example, the Venezuela with the Petrocaribe. So our debt started to reduce, and government had more breathing space to be able to come up and assist the Belizean people who was in dire need of COVID just coming, of unemployment skyrocketed, on poverty at the highest that it could have been. So we had this successful super bond. So we as part of the transaction, they had to prepare an endowment fund, and among other things, as is right now, the conditions that are being met falls under the office of the Prime Minister. So that in itself indicates that, okay, yes, government is serious, government is committed to achieving what we have as the conditions in this super bond. The endowment fund is there, producing 4 million US every year, and assigning it to conservation. So the work is ongoing. It's new to us, so it's taking a bit of time to see its full implementation. Certain committees, as was mandated, has been formed, task force, studies. So it's moving. To my understanding, which I'm not directly working closely with them, but overall the picture shows that it has been working fair enough. Certain areas that can improve, but I guess with stories like Corby with no difficult, Corby will help us with provide the data that we want specifically for that city that we have identified, Belize and its surrounding. So I think we are moving in the right direction, and I do hope that countries are able to implement. But as again, it has to be structured, it has to be focused, it has to be well thought, because you cannot just in the case of Belize, we did it because of our high debt, and because we also are an ambitious country that we wanted to conserve our and protect our environment. I hope I was able to answer the questions.
That's terrific. I mean, that really helps us understand the debt for nature swap and how it's given you, as you said, the breathing room, your country, the breathing room to reduce some debt and focus on other issues while you're creating this super fund and this endowment fund. And frankly, I mean, you're really leading the world in this. I mean, you are the example, not that there's a lot of pressure put on your shoulders, but we're all behind you, and I think I feel confident, having worked with you, that this is going to work. But I'm going to turn it back to Svetlana if I can, because there was another issue you touched on for a second and said, maybe we can talk more about that, and that is the carbon credits. So we know that like billions of dollars have been mobilized in carbon credits for ecosystem preservation and to keep the carbon sequestered. But there's been some controversy recently about the carbon credit market. I'm wondering if you can sort of, as probably one who's more expert than others here, sort of touch on that and explain, what has been causing it to maybe fail a little, what could make it be more successful, what has been your experience?
Mm-hmm. So, and I have to put forward this caveat that I don't spend my full work just working on the carbon credit markets, but yeah. I suppose I am a sufficiently informed amateur in that area. So, indeed, as you said, so we have a very interesting question on this in front of us, because as we mentioned, there are particular areas related to the nature finance agenda where existing sources of funding are not enough and they're not going to close this gap, right? So we know that we just need to create some form of the new market or new financing mechanism. So, and carbon markets, whether it is energy or nature markets, they're trying to do just that. Now, I have spent a big part of my life working on different kinds of finance, and I worked on the establishment of the global market for the sustainability reporting, for example. And one feature that any new market has in common is that for this kind of market to function, you need to have a transparency and you need to have a very well-defined and harmonized standards as to how this market is going to function. And what do I mean by this? So first, you need to agree what kind of underlying activities are going to qualify, right? So that we all know exactly which kind of projects are going to produce this kind of credits. Then you need to have the harmonized standards which assure quality of this carbon credit. So whether it comes from DRC or from Brazil or from Indonesia, that we would know that we have the comparable level. We need to have assurance that the pricing of these carbon credits is fair and consistent and transparent. And only once you have these key elements, and then, of course, you have the clear standards on what defines the high-quality carbon credit, would it be nature, ocean, biodiversity, or energy, right? So for this kind of market to work, you really need to have a combination of the clearly defined global framework, so that there are rules of the game, there are clear guardrails, and there is a safety net, so that if there are questions, you know where to go for arbitration. And then you need to have a very extensive capacity building at the level of the country. Because to establish any kind of new market, it's a big lift. So in my view, for this effort to succeed, really going forward, there needs to be this sort of parallel work at the global level, and there are a few organizations which are now actively engaged in all this, and once again, in my view, it would be better for everybody if these different efforts will sort of merge. You probably know that the UK and France are leading development of this roadmap for the high-quality biodiversity credits, which will be announced at the COP by one of the climate champions. And in reality, some components of setting up the market for the biodiversity credit will be exactly the same as for any other credit, right? The quality assurance arrangements, the standards. So, this part really needs to be harmonized. Where different credits would differ, it's the taxonomy of the underlying projects, right? So the projects which would qualify for biodiversity credits would differ from energy credits. So in summary, what is the most important from these 3 minutes that I have spent explaining this is that first you need to have a clear global framework on this that is acceptable for key stakeholders and that defines key blocks of what constitutes a well-functioning transparent market. And then you need to have a lot of capacity building at the country level so that countries also understand what all this is about, that they don't enter this with some notion which is not realistic, either about pricing or about the number of buyers or the quantity and quality of the products. And only when you have these two, then this would work.
Okay, and so before I go on to Ilana with another question, do you have hope we're heading in the right direction?
Well, look, I of course I have hope. This is why I have the job that I have, right?
Right. So we all have hope. Yeah. Okay. So, Ilana, I'm going to really switch to a whole nother topic. I mean, it's not a whole nother topic because it's really focused also on ecosystems, but it's like you wearing your other hat, if I could. Many countries, and when we were in Madagascar, we saw it with its mining, are forced to pursue extractive industries that can damage the ecosystems on which, either you are natural protections or are feeding other industries like fisheries or whatnot. And so, when international funders are funding the big mines or funding, some of the other activities, oil and gas, whatever, for development, how do we sort of strengthen bringing in, I mean, you were talking about it a little bit before, but from your experience wearing your other hat, the people and the poverty to really strengthen what's needed to make sure that nature gets into part of that dialogue?
Yeah. I have so many thoughts here, so I'm going to try to keep it focused. But I would say what's very interesting here is something that was raised to me by one of our council members who's from the Democratic Republic of Congo. She looks at the public health and mining communities. And she said, well, these communities depend heavily on these extractive activities. So if we are to shift and no longer depend on these extractive activities, what becomes of their livelihoods and their well-being? And so while we're thinking of we need to pull back from such activities, it's also important that we set up and make sure that these governments and communities are empowered and have the governance to be able to support their communities, that have the insight and are part of those international negotiations so that they can provide input and bring back information and set themselves up for a better future. So in one case, she said, even if we set them up for preparing for a circular economy as opposed to extractive activities, just so that their economies, there's something. But what's also interesting is just this need, I think, to reduce overall. Another one of my council members from Cameroon noted, people in Africa are not looking at electricity. There's still, many of the nations, a lot of communities are still relying on wood for fire and warmth. And so a lot of the reduction needs to come from developed nations. And I think this speaks to the wealth disparities and some of the dysfunctions. It comes back to the debt that Carlos was discussing and that burden of debt. And if we think about what determines the amount of debt that excludes a country from being able to have more reasonable finance, right? Who's making up these rules? Why is this happening? This is a little bit of a detour, but I think it's really important to remember that these wealth disparities, that's going to be the linchpin of stability across a number of nations. And so how do we more better address these wealth disparities, better support countries where we're extracting a lot of these minerals for our own good? How do we make sure the benefits reach those communities? How do we reduce our extraction so it doesn't negatively impact the environment that these communities depend on. And then if we do that transition, how to set those communities up so that they have something that they can rely on. Somewhat related as well is that one of the members noted, when you put in a road, right, when you allow for mining in a certain area, you're not only allowing access for those critical minerals, but you offer, when you put in these roads to start accessing a certain area, you offer access for poaching, for illegal timber, and for conflict, and so it really just opens up the box, and it's why we got to be very mindful of what we're pursuing in the name of climate, right? And so if it's really to reduce our carbon emissions, what can we do as a whole that doesn't necessarily need more extraction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to be very clear, focused, understand what's going on, have the plan, open up the blinders a little bit, look beyond, more integrated and holistic. So what I'd like to do is just see if we have any questions from the audience. We have a few coming in online. And Noah is going to pass the, any questions? Yes.
Yeah,
Sophie.
Yeah, hi, Sophie Hammer, German Embassy. Thank you very much for all your important all the important information you gave us. I have a very, very basic question to all of you. How, from your perspective, how will the lack of climate finance impact COP28? And especially, of course, the willingness of the countries in the so-called Global South to make any commitments?
Well, that's an interesting question, and honestly, it's one of my wrap-up questions. So let me first go to Carlos and see, will your Prime Minister or President be attending COP, and what do you think will happen if there's not enough climate finance announced for island states and developing countries?
Yeah, indeed, it's a very good question. It's a bit of concern that the replenishment for GCF has not reached the level that it should have reached. But Belize, as a champion on climate change, will be at the forefront at COP28, and a delegation will be led, yes, by the Honorable Prime Minister John Briceño, which is the Minister of Finance, Economic Development, and Investment as well. So we expect that he will deliver one of those speeches that would be impactful, and that we be able to reach out to the country that really needs to pledge. We have our NDC's financing gap is 1.6 billion. So financing it's needed. We need in order for us to be able to achieve our targets for NDCs. The financing gap is very wide. So we do look forward how the loss and damage will come, and the other financing that's on the horizon. So, but yep.
So I think what I'm hearing is it's going to be a very vocal, not just delegation from Belize, but I think from all developing countries and island states on this topic of how do they fund their NDCs, and the issue of loss and damage, of course, was just starting to bubble up in a big way. Do either of you want to comment on that? Your boss will be there, and many people from the World Bank.
Well, perhaps, and as I explained, I focus much more on the nature side of the climate finance, at least in my current job. So what I see happening there is that there is actually quite a lot of interesting work which is underway, which probably will not fully mature by this COP, but I also would be watching what is going to be coming out of Brazil, because if you think about this, Brazil is a systemically important country from any perspective, and also their emission profile is very much skewed towards nature, right? So nature is important for them. They have the biggest share of the Amazon biome, And on the 1st of December, they're assuming the G20 presidency. And then after the G20 presidency, they start preparation for the COP30. So for 2 years, sort of global dialogue from a few different perspectives is going to be dominated by this particular country. So my hope is that we are actually, at least in this space of the nature finance and nature-based solutions, we are going to see something interesting and significant coming out of this leadership by Brazil, which is also the major global south country, to your question. So.
Great. So I have another question for you, or if you would like to answer that one.
I guess just briefly, one of the thoughts I had was, looking at that adaptation gap last night. I was looking at the numbers and I thought, this is steep. 215 to 387 billion or so. But then I was like, out of curiosity, how much do harmful subsidies come to? And it was about 1.25 trillion. And I know OECD was pushing for discussions around oil subsidies, oil and gas, fossil fuel subsidies. And so it makes me think, is there opportunity for that push on harmful subsidies? Thinking about the nature-based solutions, the value there. How do we flip the script? But I don't know if that's happening at COP28, but that's something that I see. Well, there's the finance.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, WTO in my other hat of world of fisheries has really been trying to, ramp down on harmful subsidies. So wouldn't it be interesting if we could ramp it up in the oil and gas industry? So, yes, you have a question.
Thanks. Remo Gassmann, I'm from the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in DC. Thank you so much for your explanations and discussions. And I had a brief question, also a bit naive maybe, but since we're talking about different sources of funding, also private funding, and you all mentioned also the role of responsibility of the Global North to a certain extent, I was wondering about the question of, especially in extractive industries, taxation, which personally I'm coming from Switzerland. There is a certain long-standing rule that taxation often does not benefit the countries where most of these damages are happening. And if you think, obviously it's not something that the World Bank is working on, but especially with partners in the G20, also WTO and so forth, if that is something where this pull with the climate benefits of better taxation would maybe unlock some more financing. Thank you very much.
Taxation. Either have comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, this was a discussion that has come up a lot with our council because it's just that. It's even though there's that taxation in place, it often doesn't go back to the communities. And another point that was made was when there's less strong governance, it's fine, but when there's a weak governance system, oftentimes a huge injection of wealth actually leads to a lot of corruption, and those aren't received, those benefits don't go to the communities. So it's really about how do we set up the tools for government so you have a strong governance system so those tax benefits do go down, and also having kind of check-ins. I mean, there's a lot of discussions about what needs to be done, and that's still considerations, but also pieces to bring to mind, because you're absolutely right. Taxation doesn't always necessarily work.
And, if I could just say, from our own experience, even just going to Madagascar, I mean, there are some big industries that are rolling in there, extractive industries, and they're also a big port that's being, funded by Japan and the extractive industries by Canada and Japan and South Korea, et cetera. But the funds coming out of those resources are going back to the national government. And the national government seems to be the ones leading all those discussions. Yet in the city of Tomasina, where we're doing our Corby assessment, the municipality, they're just not yet, hopefully when we do our assessment it'll come more clear, they're not yet benefiting from these, and added into the cost of those to the community, it's not being added in an economic way so that so we get the true understanding of the true costs and hopefully the true benefits to the extent they exist. And so we have like 3 minutes left, but we did have one question that's related to that, that maybe you can help with, Ilana, which is, how are, you talked about social returns, which I think sort of falls on what I was just talking about and your question. How do we quantify social returns?
I love the quote that's like, not everything that counts. Not everything you can count counts, and not everything that you can't count doesn't count. I don't know. Albert Einstein said it better. But the idea is like, obviously, we're trying to quantify things. We're so set in metrics, and really like, I'm not saying that metrics aren't important, but I feel as though metrics have led us astray oftentimes, or we're, sometimes in this spiral of metrics where maybe we need to go and do the impact. That is not an answer necessarily, but that's my answer.
Actually, I'd like to point to something very concrete that is happening in this space. So as some of you would know, a couple of years ago, the new standard setting board, International Sustainability Standards Board, was established specifically to create the standards which would help to quantify the dimensions related to the environment and social sphere, right? So it was a very important development, and so it is focused on the global capital markets. It is supported by the IOSCO, International Organization of Regulators of Stock Exchanges. They have issued their first standard, which is focused on climate specifically. So now a good number of countries, jurisdictions have decided to adopt this. And so right now, they just finished the public consultations as to how their standards focused on the nature and social are going to look like. So there is actually a very concrete work that is taking place in terms of how to quantify these dimensions. Now, it is not going to be easy, right? Because once again, if you are the global standard setter, you aspire to create the global baseline, you need to create something that different jurisdictions from China to Argentina to United States to South Africa are going to be able to live with, right? So, but this project is supposed to start in the coming months.
Well, I think we should connect on that, because in our Corby projects, we do use a social indicator that we've been focusing on. And I know you have, okay, we have 2 minutes. So
just one, because thinking about this, the reason why I thought about social outcomes being very important for financial, the return on investment is because when I was working with the World Resources Institute, I was looking at a map they had of coastal communities and conflict area, and they said a lot of people that use this is actually investors, because they want to understand where there's conflict. And if you think about it, even from the mining perspective, conflict ends up interrupting like returns on investment and whatnot. So if you think about returns or that social dimension in that sense of buy-in and more collaboration and less conflict and less disruption, that can actually be one way of thinking about it as well.
yeah, and I think that's a great way to, I said we have a social indicator. We have a category that we focus on and quantify social vulnerabilities, which is really important. So one last, if each person could think of one sentence or one thing they hope coming out of COP. I mean, we're all hopeful. I can't really get that sense from everybody. If there's one thing that you are hopeful that will come out of COP, what is it? And so for me, I'm hoping that the voices of island states and developing countries will be heard on an equal par with the developing countries, and that, there is no one who believes more than I do that mitigation is absolutely important. But we need to bring them up together, not imbalance them. Carlos, do you have a thought as a small island state representative?
No, my position would be Belize is as a small seats with less than 400,000. There's no way that we will be able to make a big noise. But as part of OASIS, we believe that going as a region, going as a region, I think our voices might be heard, and you will see it from our head of states. They will be there present, and they will bring up the message that yes, we are suffering. Climate change is here. Climate change has a mega appetite for what we are experiencing, and we need help.
bring all the island states together in one voice. Okay. Alana?
You know what, I just keep thinking about the Descupta review, the economics of biodiversity, and just how valuable biodiverse regions are for low-income communities, and so really hopeful that that can come to light, and really that idea of inclusion so that we can protect those natural systems.
Biodiversity, absolutely. And Svetlana, you have the last word.
Well, for me, I link this to what you said. For me, it would be the better collaboration between global North and global South focused on a few very concrete things. Right now, there is a lot of different things here and there. Find something in common and work together.
Commonality, work together, North and South. That is a great way to end. And let me just say, what a terrific panel. We could have gone on for another hour. Anyway, thank you, everyone. Thanks to folks on the line. Carlos, see you later. Thank you. Thanks. Nice job.